Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and of course this is, once again, Ashley Hlebinsky.
Sorry, I was getting my phone out of the shot.
And she's getting her phone out of the shot, so now we're good to go.
All right,
yes?
Yeah, we're here. It's time to drink.
Yes. So we have you back to talk about museums.
Yeah.
Once again.
I think it's like the third time.
Yes, because I enjoy these conversations, and I think a lot of you guys enjoy these conversations, and Ashley gets in trouble because of these conversations.
I don't get in trouble.
No?
I mean, we'll find out. But well, the good thing, and I think the thing that's different now is that I'm still consulting for museums, but I am no longer affiliated as an employee of one of the museums. So I have a little bit more freedom.
Now, aren't you still... what was it, Curator Emeritus or something?
I'm not really doing, so the center kind of, they changed leadership, so they shifted a lot of the different like titles and things, and so right now I'm helping out if Danny needs it, but I'm really not that involved.
Okay.
Well, that involved. I'm doing the podcast still.
Okay.
But yeah, and it's good because one, Danny's awesome and needs, and doesn't need me like hovering around. I'm very small, but I'm a very big presence. And then, two, it's also good for me because it does allow me to be, a free agent, essentially, which
that is good.
I really enjoy being. So, and it was time. I mean, 10 years.
That's a long time.
It's a long time.
I know that. That's
I mean, I guess there's probably people listening like, that's not that long.
That is as long as I've been doing Forgotten Weapons.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. 10 to 11, it's somewhere right in there.
So, okay. So now I'm like, wait.
That threw you for a loop,
I
didn't it?
did. I thought you were like, I mean, you were already famous by the time I knew about you. How fast did that go?
It took a couple of years before anyone ever recognized me anywhere.
I guess it's probably like, I've got some on my thumb.
Sorry.
I think that it's because when I started, you were then established, although my career goes a little bit earlier than yours because it's been about almost 15 years since I've been doing museum stuff.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, 15 years, but it's like musical chairs
Yes.
with whiskey. But no, it's because as soon as I started doing research and looking things up for the Cody Museum, you were already there. So I guess I
might have been.
I mean, you had to have been.
I'm trying to remember when the first time was that I actually went up there. And...
Oh, no, I meant just in general, like when I was trying to do research on different things, not that you had done about the Cody collection, but things that were in the Cody collection. I mean, your name popped up everywhere.
Okay.
So, I mean,
Good for me.
I know, I was like, so I can't, like in my brain, you've been doing this for like 15, 20 years, but I guess not. You just know how to become more famous than me. It's the beard.
It probably is.
Yeah, it's the beard. Yeah. So we should probably explain what's happening here.
So yes, I figured in order to get the truth about museums, we should ply you with whiskey.
This is dangerous.
So I have brought a bottle of Kyro.
Okay.
Single malt, 100% rye. Fantastic Finnish whiskey.
All right. And I don't think I've ever had Finnish whiskey. So.
It is 47.2%.
Okay.
And is a true single malt. So... just like it's not single malt Scotch, which would be barley,
okay,
but it's rye grain, but it is a single batch, no blending, single distillation. It's really good.
All right.
And you brought
Thumb Butte.
I don't think that's
Thumb Butte. But I'm a child. That's fine. And I knew nothing about this. It was just in my whiskey collection. Rodeo rye. And it's distilled in Prescott, which is where we are right now, which is why I brought it up.
And conveniently, I tried it yesterday because I actually went out and visited the Thumb Butte distillery.
Yeah.
And tried their rodeo rye.
Which is funny because my husband must have bought it at some point because we've got quite the whiskey cabinet and many that aren't open. So I apologize. I would have brought something that you hadn't tried, but
no, it's good whiskey.
All right.
So, which do you want to try first?
Let's
start
do
with
yours.
Let's start with the Thumb Butte because then you'll really appreciate how good.
Okay. All right. Wait till you get cheers.
Cheers.
All right.
The finest in plastic hotel conference room glassware. I stole 2 rocks glasses from the restaurant area.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you put mine in plastic and yours in glass. Tells you
You'll understand when you try it.
How.
I mean, it's good.
It's good.
It's
yeah,
good
it's
rye.
fine. Yeah.
I opted not to buy a bottle of it when I was there.
Yeah.
I did buy a bottle of their Western Sage gin.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said, and it tastes really good too. So I haven't actually, I did the little sampler taster at the distillery. I haven't opened the bottle yet. I'm curious how it's going to actually mix.
Okay.
St. George has a terroir gin that is spruce tip that smells fantastic and it tastes really interesting on its own. And I got a bottle and then discovered there's nothing you can do with it. It mixes with nothing.
Yeah.
Like, you make a martini out of that vermouth and it does not play well with vermouth.
Oof. I don't drink gin that much. When I was in Amsterdam a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, I started getting into Geneva a little bit, which nobody ever. I figured if anyone knew what I was talking about, you would know what I was talking about.
I may have a bottle of pre-prohibition Genever.
Oh my God.
That I have not opened.
Ooh.
That I'm scared to open.
I didn't realize when I was in Europe, I was trying to drink whiskey throughout like Italy and England, and it was rough. It was rough for me. So when we went to Amsterdam, I remember at one of our symposia, one of the symposiums we did, we have a guy named Matthew who comes from the Dutch National Military Museum, and one year he brought bowls. So which I learned is like bottom shelf. Well, what he brought was, but it was still delicious.
They're a very old company.
Yeah.
And today they make $6.99 flavored liqueurs.
Yeah.
But they started off as a Genever distillery.
Yeah, and so that was what he brought, and we drank all of it. Like the one night. There was more, it was not just me and another person. There was a handful of people, but it was so good. So like when we went to Amsterdam, I'm like, oh, we have to get this. And so then we got it. And Mark's like, oh, my husband, Mark, is like, oh, this is fantastic. And then I was looking for a whiskey bar because that's back when I was writing. I was a brand ambassador for a Bourbon Review magazine. And they were like, we'll go to this. It's a Genever, I guess is how you pronounce it. You just go to this bar and it's whiskey in both. And so we ended up tasting those the whole night. And I can't find it like anywhere.
You can't really get Genever here.
There
a little
is
bit now, but not much.
The Lux bar inside the Palazzo Hotel has bowls.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. So I get that every time just so I can have something different for SHOT Show and to be like, oh, I'm fancy with all of my work people.
All right, now
Okay.
the Kyro.
That probably looked really weird on camera, didn't it? Oh, that's good.
Right?
That's really good.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just going to say for the record, I'm very bad at like being like, it tastes like vanilla with hint of maple. So I'm just going to say I liked it.
I have a terrible vocabulary. For
Oh, yeah. I have the
spirits
little
tasting.
wheel, but I just never. I wrote an article for Recoil that was like non-Kentucky whiskeys or bourbons. Bourbon, but not bourbon. And my tasting notes were weird. A lot of times I'll be like, this reminds me of a blacksmith shop. Or I tried to like make comparisons in my mind now to like, what gun does this remind me of? It only makes sense to me. But no, that's good. I like it.
Good. All right, so that can go over there. Sorry, Prescott. It's good, but it's not that good.
So we'll drink the good stuff.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so now, 10 minutes in or whatever, we can actually talk about museums.
Yes. Right?
Top that off a little bit for you.
This has been
There you go.
probably the longest introduction to.
Yes.
People probably stopped watching.
We'll
now.
see if we leave this all in the introduction.
Yeah, I'm just a little concerned that like a screen grab of me like moving that whiskey around in my mouth is going to become a meme.
You can't help it. Don't fight it. If it will, it will.
I'm pretty sure I'm about to just be mortified when I watch this back. All right.
So, I touched a few nerves, I think, with the last museum video that we did.
So there was the museum video you did, and then there was the museum video we did with Danny. And was there
Yes.
another one, or is that the last one?
There was a reaction video from the curator of the Panzer Museum,
Okay.
who made some very good points. Didn't agree with me in general.
Okay.
I'm more interested, I think this time what we should talk about is like the state of museums, how museums are designed, more that than a specific conflict between collectors and private museums. Because that's kind of been done to death.
And, theoretically, I mean, a lot of museums are kind of the shrine to a private collector initially, and then it, goes into other collectors. And that was always just one thing about collectors is that bummed me out with museums is that you don't really get the background of the person unless the person was famous, the collector, unless the collector was famous. And by famous, I mean like, almost said Arnold Schwarzenegger, but that would have been a really weird example. I don't know why that was the first name that came into my brain. But so like, unless they're a celebrity or a historically significant figure.
Right.
But even big name collectors that like we would all know, that never gets interpreted.
Nobody
either.
has a clue who those people are.
No.
It's like, oh, it's the real.
Like we can't even think of a person to say.
What does that even mean? Yeah.
We have the Woodruff collection, for example, and Robert W. Woodruff ran Coca-Cola for a while, and so they his collection. That one gets talked about like a smidge in the Cody Firearms Museum, but yeah, they lose that entire history, which is about the individual who collected it and why they did that. But
and so many museums start out, or I feel like they start out as a very passionate private collector who builds this thing and then wants to make it some sort of legacy.
Yeah.
They don't want it to just dissolve when they die.
Yeah.
And so they come up with some sort of foundation or
trust
or something to fund it. And unfortunately, what I see is every time that happens, you lose the passion of the collection. It doesn't tend to grow because you'll get a museum staff are chronically underfunded and understaffed. And it's very rare to find a museum where the curatorial staff are able to devote any significant amount of time to researching the items in the collection, expanding the collection, studying the collection. They're all too busy maintaining the collection.
Yeah, and look at J.M. Davis Museum is a perfect example of, a museum that was literally a private collector built this thing, and then now it's a museum, and I'm told he's buried in there. There's like a mausoleum to him in there. I've never actually been. I need to go. But yeah, I mean, that's a great example of that. But then, there's been a lot of stuff with the J.M. Davis Museum over the years. The Curator's there is great, but from before his time. And so, it does show kind of that, like you've got the one person that was really passionate, then it became a museum and people want to go there and they go there, but you do lose a little bit of it, especially with the lack of staff and underfunding is a really big thing for museums. And the other issue with museums and kind of going away from the mission of the original private collector is the fact that depending on, so if the museum is originally a private collector museum or private collection, and then that becomes a museum, when you come in as a museum professional, you have to kind of look and be like, all right, one, is this getting visitation to be able to keep the doors open?
No.
And two, is this something that people would want to come and see everything that was going on in this guy's brain?
Not.
No. And so you have to make judgment calls in order for a greater public education, institution. And so if it's just the private collector, nobody really knows what was in that guy's mind, and so then the museum professional comes in and they're like, okay, so I have to make this though digestible for the public. Which is a difficult thing because the public, although we say the public, it's so many different types of people. Right. So what's your audience and all of that. And so it's a really difficult situation that museum people are put under just because we know we can't take everything. And we dealt with that at Cody all the time where somebody, is their life collection. It actually breaks my heart, because it's like their life passion and they want to give it in its entirety to the Firearms Museum or really any museum. And then the reality is some of them can take the collection, but they can't always display all of the pieces because what made sense to that person doesn't necessarily make sense for the overall mission of the institution. And so and
they may have a lot of that stuff already.
Exactly. And so when that happens, then they either don't want to take parts of the collection or they take it and then they don't have anything to do with it because then it sits. Right. So it's a shitty situation to be honest. There was a conference that I went to during the 150th of the Battle of Gettysburg, and the one panel was reenactors, live living history interpreters, which are very different. They get really mad if you confuse the two. Living history interpreters do. And then museum professionals and academic historians. And it was probably the most contentious panel I've ever seen.
That sounds spicy.
Oh, it was spicy because it was basically the conversation of the academic is, their research is the most comprehensive, blah, 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 blah. It's, the ivory tower, but that they're the least visible. So you've got the academic work, then you've got the public educator who has to now distill that work, for, the larger audience. And the limitations the criticisms of reenactors that they had were that there are some reenactors who are great and understand the context of everything that's going on. But what happens is you get reenactors who are really interested in like their buttons or like something on the uniform. And so they welcome to do that. But if they're at a reenactment where people are asking questions, they become the person that people think knows everything, and they may not. They may just focus on a piece of a uniform or, the firearms or whatever. And then the other one that was brought up that I hadn't even thought about is some reenactors are so in character, then they don't break character. So like you literally could be talking to like General Lee, and he's the guy that's not breaking character, and you get a totally one-sided, view of the Civil War. And so it's this connection between like, the different types of backgrounds, and they're all valuable. It's just, they don't always translate for different audiences.
Right, or blend well.
Yeah. So.
Yes?
Sorry, I'm not drunk. Now I'm already sounding like I am, but I'm not, I swear.
Not yet.
No,
she's not.
yeah.
She's small, but not that small.
Mm-hmm. And I drink a lot of whiskey, so it takes a significant amount.
So, what's the best way to put together a museum on firearms?
Oh,
Or are they doing it? Is it?
who's they?
Anyone?
There's been rumblings in the community, and I've gotten some calls of people who want to start from scratch, which I honestly don't think there's a greater gift for a museum curator than to be able to start from scratch. Because usually we inherit all of these collections and their subsequent problems.
A mess.
Yeah, we inherited. It can be pretty rough, even at the nicest institutions. There's it's amazing what stuff kind of sits around because you can't adequately cover all of it with one or two staff members, and so they basically are like, we have to keep it so it doesn't get destroyed, but we can't do much more with it now. So going about museums, you and I talked about this offline yesterday. I think my dream museum, if I could build it from scratch, or even if I inherited a big collection, would be the museum, which is fewer objects, more immersive, more educational, and then the publicly accessible research library of the collection. So, and I believe really strongly in this because I hate that things go back in the vaults and people can't see them unless you call to get a private tour and the curator's available and all that stuff. So for me, I know that visitors don't always want to see everything, and some visitors want to see everything.
Right.
And museums don't really have the capacity to showcase a lot of their collections. I think 3% is usually a number you hear. Cody was 50%. Which is very exciting, or just over 50%. But you don't get that with most museums. You get about 3%. And that's partly because, like, if you see, like, the Smithsonian, the National Museum of American History, they have an entire room dedicated to buttons and pins. So, like, yeah, you're not, like, there's, hundreds of thousands of pins. That makes your numbers sound kind of skewed when you talk about what's on display. But I really do think that the museum experience should be something that, if you don't know anything about the subject matter, or you'd have an interest, you can go and learn that information.
That really is a way to cater to both the complete novice and also the serious enthusiast.
Well, and there's a lot of criticism out there about the World War II Museum in New Orleans. And like, as a person that when I go to museums, I love the experience. I guess it might be working with artifacts for my whole life. I want to go and see like how they made the cases and what interactives they have and how they're doing that and incorporating it into the larger museum. And so World War II gets a lot of crap because it's that entire experiential thing.
Right.
But a lot of people feel like it's way too surface level for the size of the institution.
I tend to agree.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's probably an objective statement.
You could almost come out of that museum and not realize that Russia was involved in World War II.
That's true. I didn't think about that.
Like, they don't even touch anywhere that the U.S. wasn't directly,
Yeah.
they don't touch.
And it's what the National World War II Museum, so it's not the national U.S. involvement of, of World War II.
I mean, it's one thing to set up a museum to be a very surface level basic education, but if you're going to do that, you should at least tell the whole story.
The whole story. Well, and so that's the thing. So that one, it's really exciting if you're just kind of going, you're a tourist and you just want to see some cool stuff, learn a little bit. I think that museums can do better at layering information. So in my perfect world where you've got the museum and then at the same site you've got a publicly accessible research center, I think that you can still do better in that museum so that, especially with media today and technology, there's no reason why you can't have surface level throughout the museum and then options for people who want to know more about something.
Absolutely. Now, Cody has the McCracken Library, which is a publicly accessible research library.
Yes, it is, but it's not necessarily how I conceive a future research library. So the McCracken is open to the public. You can schedule appointments to, pull up any of the records, but the records themselves are not, you can't just go and dig through them for, obvious reasons, but, so it's a very controlled environment. And so if you want to see something, they have a finding guide and you can kind of start to whittle down what you want to see. What I kind of envision is like the Cody's gun library almost, where you've got visible storage. So it's, the collections aren't at risk. Things can be taken if you make an appointment and you're a researcher, but that you can kind of go through and you can walk around the facility and see everything, not just see a finding guide to potentially get you kind of close. So I think that the research libraries as they stand are very valuable for researchers and kind of keeping the more papers are really difficult
so
thing
what I
to
wanted to
preserve.
ask, how many of those actually exist?
What?
A museum that actually has a research library attached to it.
Well,
I can't think of any except for Cody.
A lot of them do. Smithsonian does.
The Smithsonian is not a firearms museum.
No, oh, you mean Firearms Museum? Sorry, I was thinking everything Firearms Museum.
I love the theory of what you're talking about here, and I'm trying to think of anywhere that there's something even remotely like that.
No.
I can't come up with anything other than Cody.
I'm trying to think, because now that I will say it's just Cody, someone will be like, hey, no, don't forget. And I don't know in Europe if they have more of a balance in their exhibitions in terms of accessibility with research collections. I don't know.
The National Firearms Center, the Royal Armories, have a library that is the National Firearms Center, the serious collection of firearms is it's public but appointment only.
Yeah.
And very low level number of visitors at any time. And the library is basically the same. But it's there and it's available.
Yeah.
And the librarian there is a fantastic guy who's very helpful.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing that comes into that equation is the belief that some museum people aren't open, and I know we've talked about this a lot, so we don't have to beat a dead horse, but they aren't open to bring people in. They kind of hoard the items internally. And there is some of that, and there is some of it just were spread too thin,
I always assume it's just being spread too thin.
Yeah.
I can't think of running into any museum people who are all Gollum about no one can see it, it's all mine.
I don't know.
I don't think
I've met a lot of different kinds of museum people, and I feel like that's a reality.
It's out there?
Oh yeah, it's definitely out there.
I've met private collectors like that.
Well, yeah. Well, and then there's also different schools of thought within the museum community. So a curator.
I've met communications departments who are like that.
Yes.
The curator's like, I'd love to have you come in, and the communications department is like, no, we don't like you.
Yeah, no, that's a reality. That is actually, you hit the nail on the head on that one, because a lot of times curators want to, and then the other people pull the plug on it. But there is there's a bunch of different layers to what a curator is in different institutions. So in Cody, when I was the curator, I was basically the director of the museum. So I was responsible for everything, budgets, grants, managing the day-to-day operations, and also content, exhibitions, scholarship. Whereas a lot of museums have a curator who is an academic. So someone that is a historian that doesn't really handle the objects. And then some museums, curators are really hands-on. So it really is very specific to an individual institution, because it's just the name means way more things than people think it does.
Yeah.
And just because someone's a curator in a collection doesn't mean that they have any practical experience handling that collection. A lot of times they do, but I know that there was a movement in the Smithsonian, I think in the 80s, to basically make the curators all academics, and not really be involved in the collections as much. They were more involved in the scholarship of it. And then that left a hole where it was like, all right, so now what are the people that get to handle the collections? Like, where are they? Where do they fall into the equation? So it can be really confusing in the museum field.
Yeah. It sounds like a very powerful title. Isn't necessarily.
Well, curator?
Curator, yeah.
I won't say which museum it is, but I remember it was a big museum. But I remember going and visiting it, and it's a big museum is relevant because it speaks to the different layers of what a curator is. And so when I was getting scheduled to go meet with them, they were like, all right, well, you meet these curators, but like we'll get you with more important people. And I was like, what? I'm like, you guys know that you're talking to a curator. They're like, yeah, but you're not. Like, you're different. Like, like you're running the museum. And I just thought it was like the craziest thing that like it's curator. And then they told me that they were like, well, there's more important people that you could meet. And I thought it was so funny. But they weren't wrong. I mean, the reason I was going was to meet with more, management, the people that are designing the exhibitions. And sometimes curators really they're not involved in that other than the content side of it. So, because a lot of museums have design departments that are exhibition departments, where they plan those all out, and the curator plays a role in them, but they don't play the only role in them. And so I just thought that was kind of funny.
Unfortunately, that strikes me as this thing of like ceding the authority and the purpose and the drive of the museum towards the museum's sustainability.
Yeah.
Instead of towards the museum's content.
Yeah.
And I totally understand how that is, it's essential.
Yeah.
Because if there's no money, there's no museum.
And where do those objects go?
Right. But at the same time, if it's all administration focused and there's no passion for the collection, then it seems like just such wasted potential.
Well, and some museums really rely on contractors rather than full-time employees because a lot of times museums can't afford, full-time employees, so they get contractors for specific projects. And those contractors, they don't, they come from museum backgrounds, but they don't necessarily have that passion because they are, moved around the institution, just to make sure that they have someone who can do it. And there was a big divide that was going on. It's still going on now. I don't mean to hate on the Smithsonian, but the Smithsonian's a perfect example of some of this, which is you have the curators who are lifers, for a lot of it. And then you have, at least this was back when I was there, so, 10, 12 years ago. So it may have changed completely, but there were so many contractors and they were moved into so many different departments that you ended up having the person who was going to age out, and retire, and then who was next, because they had focused so much on having, their staff people, who were Smithsonian employees, who were government employees, and then they had contractors who weren't, who were a different class, and then they would move their contractors around so much that the contractors really, even if they had a passion area, they had to work in things that weren't their passion, which is good when you're like coming up in the ranks, but then who takes over? And I think it's caused a real big rift in the field, because there is that, like, are you a collections person, and do you care about the collections, or did they just throw this collection onto you, or are you a content person? And it should be both.
Yeah, the content and the collection should be the exact same thing.
I mean, in a lot of places it are, but it is. But at the same time, too, I mean, there's two different titles there. There's curator and there's collections manager.
Okay, so for people's benefit, what is the difference?
So a curator, well, like I said, there's like 5 million definitions for a curator. But
easier to
so
define.
Curator, let's do collections manager. So curators are content. They are supposed to know the history behind the collections. They may not be as knowledgeable in like markings and all the specifics of the particular object. For example, that's not my area. My area is looking at the history and the evolution and its impact on industry, culture, society, et cetera, for centuries. And so I know some areas where I know the markings and everything, but a lot of times I have to have a more broad knowledge. A collections manager is someone who specifically is in charge of maintaining the collection. So they don't even have to be someone that knows about guns. They just need to know how to take care of them. So they do inventories, they can do cataloging, so when the thing comes in, condition reporting, that kind of thing, and then they're stewards of the collection. They keep the collection from deteriorating over time.
So, for example, you could be a collections manager of, say, a library, without having to actually read the language that the library carries.
Yeah.
Like, I could be collections manager for a German language library.
Yeah, well, they have a different name for that, but yeah, but same.
Right.
Yeah, no, you're right. You don't,
Okay.
I mean, I guess you need to know it enough to be able to categorize it.
Yeah.
But you could always bring someone in that knew
that's it.
enough to categorize it.
I need to know how to properly take care of books and keep them in good condition.
Yeah, and organize them into the vault space so that it makes sense and that there's room for more stuff. And yeah, so because I remember, I always hear this like, oh, I wish I had your job. I wish I had your job. When I was at Cody, and I'm like, do you know the last time I held a gun? For a long time there. Danny, when Danny, who's now the curator, was the assistant curator, which was my old position, as an assistant, you get to handle things far more because I was, running the museum, project directing the renovation and coordinating all these people. And so, everyone was like, I want your job. I'm like, I don't know if you know what that means.
You want Danny's job.
You want Danny's job right now, and even then, they don't always, they may have collections managers, but the center didn't have collections managers for each museum. They did have one for the entire institution, which is 5 museums. So that's 5 museums. So they're clearly very, very different museums: art, Plains Indian culture, natural history, Buffalo Bills Wild West stuff, and firearms. So you have one collections manager for 5 museums.
That's a busy person.
And that's not necessarily obviously an expert.
Right.
Expert in the field. They're just preserving all of these different things, and they've got that background to do that. But yeah,
Right.
Collections manager means don't ruin the collections. Just make sure that they survive.
Okay. So you are currently working on a new museum.
Couple of them, yeah.
You were telling me about a cool firearms museum.
Firearms museum?
Yes.
Which one?
Well, a museum full of firearms.
Well, both of them. Well, all 3 of them are actually that I'm working on right now. So we can go in no particular order, but there's a couple of really interesting collections that I've stumbled across. So one, I'm working on redoing the renovation. They were actually my first client, 7 years ago when I started consulting, and they called me back, which means they must not have been too
Must
upset.
have found something they liked.
They had an exhibition. So I initially came in and processed the firearms and provided some guidance on exhibitions, but then they had changed hands so many times they didn't know really that I was involved. So they installed the exhibition, and so they need to make modifications to it. And so that collection is the Matthew Browning collection. Yeah.
That sounds interesting.
It's really interesting, and it's a lot of it's the family, beyond Matthew. They all a lot of them were named Matthew. So we're working on that, and I'm hoping to angle the exhibition more towards the Matthew Browning story because everyone talks about John Moses Browning, but they don't talk about Matthew. And Matthew has his name on so many of the patents, and so. That's an interesting avenue that I don't think has really been explored too much in the Browning world. And then I'm also helping to reimagine the LA Police Museum.
That's the one that sounds like it's full of all sorts of interesting and cool stuff.
So the best thing about there's so many things I like about this museum, but as a curator nerd here, provenance, okay? Proving that this thing is actually what it says it is the number one problem in museums, and there have been different schools of thought over the years where there used to be a whole thing where if somebody signed an affidavit saying it was this, that was considered enough provenance to be legitimate. I mean, it still goes on.
What could possibly go wrong with that?
I know, right? Well, it's a legal document. Who will rely on a legal document? Yeah.
I'm donating this for the tax credit.
Yeah.
Yes, it's absolutely John
absolutely.
Browning's personal Philadelphia Derringer worth $300,000.
Exactly.
But I'm giving it to you.
Yeah, I'm just
And,
that.
yes, sign the thing and boop.
Yeah, so there's a whole spectrum of acceptable provenance, and that's where I always joke about when you read labels at museums and it's rumored to have been possibly maybe in the hands of
the best friend of.
Yeah. So the cool thing about this museum, they're autonomous from the LAPD, but because they're in an old LAPD headquarters, so that the building in and of itself is really cool. But they're getting stuff from the LAPD, from evidence, from closed cases, and so as a result, It is the stuff.
Police chain of custody is probably
It's
pretty
probably
good
pretty
provenance.
solid provenance. And so, but the thing with them is they've got the building, like I said, this really cool old building, and they've got, then they've got the jail cells. I mean, they've got the felony cells, they've got the misdemeanor cells, and then, they also have all of these collections. And so they've got things obviously tied to the LAPD,
Right.
a lot of police cars and drones, all kinds of things out. They've got this outside area where they've got all these vehicles, but then obviously the LAPD has been in, had some very notorious, crime incidents, over the years. And so they've got right now on display, it's open right now. It just doesn't have a lot of visitation. They've got the mugshot from the Night Stalker. It was actually really cool because the board chair arrested the Night Stalker before they knew he was the Night Stalker. So he was arrested once, got his mugshot, and that's how they worked to identify him. So that mugshot you see in all the Netflix documentaries, that's that mugshot. They've got one of my favorites because I studied radical armed activism in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Patty Hearst M1 carbine.
Neat.
Yeah, from the bank. It was seized, and that was hers because it was seized from the SLA. And they've got this pipe bomb that the SLA was kind of like their last ditch effort. They put this. It's not a Waffle House. Maybe it was a Waffle House. There's a photo of it. It's like a diner like that, and these cops were inside eating. And this SLA came, and they put this pipe bomb underneath the police car, and it fell. It fell off the car. So no one got hurt. I guess the SLA did, but it was kind of one of their last things. They've got a display on the Onion murders, the Onion Field murders, which I need to go back and actually learn about that. I think it's my understanding that the police officers were, I'm going to butcher this and someone's going to be like, that's not what it is. I am not an LAPD historian, so there I come in. My expertise is more in dealing with sensitive objects. But that was one of the catalysts for why police officers carry backup guns, because their guns were taken from them and they were executed.
Oops.
Yeah, so if I remember that one correctly. But then the other one that I think is, it's like chills. They have a North Hollywood shootout room, which also at one point Bank of America gave them money. That was the bank. You just at that point you gotta give the bank credit, you gotta give them credit for, because there was a sign above it and I'm like, was this an actual did they donate at some point? They're like, yeah. But so they have all of the gear, the clothing.
Right, those guys were wearing all sorts
armor
of
plate,
together body armor.
Body armor, all of it. And it is I've gone there twice now, and the first time I didn't even think about it. The second time I was like, wait, there's blood on that, right? Because it's all dark clothing, so it didn't really look at it. Because the one guy was shot, I think 29 times in the leg. It was Emil, big last name that I can't pronounce.
Yeah, I don't remember.
He's the craziest last name. But yeah, so so they've got all of that. They've got all the firearms. They've got the police guns. They've got the perps car. They've got the first police car that arrived on the scene. Both are shot to hell. So they've got everything with North Hollywood shootout. They've got the other thing about them too is that they've got a lot of stuff that's still confidential files. So as they get permission to release it, because of open cases and that kind of thing, they'll be able to display more and more. And some of those cases might have something to do with Marilyn Monroe. And the Manson family. And they have some stuff from the Manson family on display, but yeah, they've got these back rooms. And this is a really cool thing because there's stuff in there that nobody has ever seen. People have done biographies and they've never seen it because it can't be released. So the neat thing about them is that they want to show it and they will show it when they can, which
cool.
You get a lot of hesitancy from some museums to be like, that's really morbid. I don't know if we should showcase that. And they're totally open to it. They're like, let's, this is what we do. So they've got that's a lot of stuff I listed, but
you are clearly very excited about
I'm
this
so
project.
excited. Yes. My passion is dark tourism and why people are drawn to the macabre and why people go to sites in mourning. And I am a true crime enthusiast. Literally every time my husband walks into the house, I don't know if this should be concerning for him or not. I don't know, because I've been watching the show Deadly Women, so maybe he should be a little worried. But I will watch any Netflix, Hulu, whatever documentary that comes out on murder shows. There was an SNL music video they did about women and their obsession with watching murder shows and cult shows. So that's me.
That's you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. I'm
know.
the stereotype 100%. So I've been always fascinated by guns that are used in crime. So, Cody's mostly a military and sporting collection, but even the military guns a lot of times are, off the line. They weren't
Right.
used in military conflict. And so I'm very passionate about, okay, so you have this thing, it can be anything. It can be a gun, it can be a knife, it can be whatever, a samurai sword. Very creative, modern perp to use a samurai sword. But so you've got the object. It was actually at a traumatic event. So how do you interpret the history of what happened and not sterilize it and not glorify it? And so it's a really interesting, especially when we're talking about all of the cult classics. You've got Manson and Richie Ramirez and like everything that's on Netflix like is at this museum. So they're really trying to figure out. And right now, it's very much your old school museum of labels. Not like a lot of labels, but like objects on display, but not really curated that much. A little bit,
Okay.
but not a ton. And so, that's the question: is they're willing to have the conversations and to do the history, but how do you actually? What does that look like? in the
It's a
long run?
fine line to walk.
Yeah.
Yeah, to not veer off too far to either side.
Yeah, it's very difficult. There have been whole conferences about that, especially in the military
Sure.
history field of like how do you go about interpreting war, and this is a little bit of the issue, well, not issue, but debate within the museum field, because there are military museums of the old school where it's the guns and the weapons and the uniforms and everything on display with very little, immersion. And there are a lot of people that think in the museum field, you shouldn't glorify any of that. And so they either don't want to display it or they want to, create an advocacy, if you will.
Display and glorify aren't quite the same thing.
Sometimes you hear
The idea that, they can be.
yeah.
But the idea that by having it on display, you are de facto glorifying it.
Yeah, well, that's
I'm not entirely comfortable with that.
The museum
conclusion.
world has some weirdos. Actually, I mean, that was weird. That's one of the things that I don't agree with in a lot of the museum field. Is a lot of the museum field is moving to concepts of advocacy. So, like, and I think there's some worlds where that makes sense. So, Eastern State Penitentiary is, I guess has some displays. It's been a long time since I've been there, but it was doing stuff on like modern prison systems.
Okay.
And prison reform, and what they've learned since Eastern State, which is a whole interesting history. And I think in that world that makes sense, I guess to some extent. But then at the same time, I would then say that's not the case with guns, and and like a gun control group coming in and putting their spin on it. But I think if you're able to kind of give it like lay it out and then say this is where we are today and let people kind of connect their own dots, I think that works. But the idea is that museums can, like, the people can have this idea of objective morality, and therefore the people who work in the museum, if they feel like it's immoral, then they will say it's immoral. And I don't really think a museum should be doing that. Years ago, there was a change, and I don't know if it ever stuck or what happened, because there was a lot of disagreement about it. But there was a change in the definition, or suggested change in the definition of museum with some international museum association, and it was, I don't remember what it was, but it was like crazy. I mean, it made no sense. I mean, it literally said that, like, it basically said that it was a museum, but there was really nothing that was a museum, and the curators, really shouldn't be responsible for putting out the material. It should be kind of visitor experience, and yeah, it's.
Have we not learned the errors of user-generated content?
I don't know.
It's fine in some applications.
Yeah, and there's no vetting system, and there's this whole belief too that, like, if I as a curator write a label, that I'm like talking down to you. And so there's been a lot of movement to try to make museums about taking a side, I guess is what it is, and I don't really think that museums should take a side. I mean, obviously, objectivity is not achievable, and you'll always be biased, but to take a firm side, I don't know if that's...
The purpose of the museum is to take the side of the artifacts.
Yeah,
to show
no, that's
the artifacts
perfect.
for what they are.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect
then-
way to think about it.
And you present it that way, and then people can come in and do whatever they want to do with those artifacts.
Yeah.
With the basic. It's a way to share a foundational level of fact, of understanding that these objects are reality.
Yeah.
And we agree that these are real, this is an objective reality here.
Yeah.
And now I can make theories or interpretations based on that. But the whole point of the museum, to my mind, would have to be presenting that base level objective reality truth.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say it's an objective opinion.
Yeah.
It's just, it is objective reality because it's sitting there and it is a tangible, real thing.
Yeah. There's a lot though with the object itself. If people don't know, if the museum person doesn't know the object enough, then there are modifications that could have been made to it over time.
True.
And so then you're looking at it. But the idea of objective reality is almost like it's like an optical illusion because it might be there, but it might not be what you think it is, kind of thing. So I mean, yes, and also if you don't have the curator that knows exactly what it is, it can be kind of
it may not
difficult.
be an achievable goal, but I think that's one that's worth working toward. At least it's worth that being the goal, even if you can't quite get to it.
Well, and then there's the other of who writes the narrative and who owns the narrative to be discussed. And the only example I'll give of this, which is really funny, we applied for a humanities grant, a government grant. They gave us one for like the prep going into the renovation, but they didn't give us the implementation grant.
You talking about Cody?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you, Cody. And so we had to submit for the implementation grant, we had to submit like text that was going to go into the museum to give them a sense of, sampling of what the museum would be. And I laughed so hard because one of the reviewers was like, this is just of course biased a little bit against guns.
Shocking.
This is this is just the same thing, you always hear. This is written by an old white guy and his voice, and you're not telling other people's stories and all this stuff. And I'm like, I'm not an old white guy. A lot of people say that I should identify as one, but I thought it was so funny because they wrote the museum off assuming that I was an old white guy, and how dare I, feel that I could write about other, groups, marginalized groups, and conflicts. And I just thought that was so funny because it does speak to that whole like, well, this old white guy who's running the Cody Firearms Museum shouldn't be writing about, the Native history. But the reality is that we worked with the Plains Indian Museum. When we were at, Danny and I were at the National Council on Public History years ago giving a panel, and I had this weird back and forth with one of the girls in the room because I had given a presentation about what the renovation was going to be. We were going to talk about, everybody, the African American experience, and the female experience with firearms, like all of the history. Like we were bringing out all of these voices so that people didn't think, it was only an old white guy thing. And, the question went back and forth because I couldn't grasp what she was saying, but ultimately she was asking me if I'd ever asked anyone from those groups anything about it. And I was like, yeah, it's just,
obviously.
I was like, yes, and so it was just, there's this mindset in the museum world that like, if you are not representing that group, that you cannot write the panel or the label. And I think obviously, if you can talk to a source that has the expertise, that's wonderful. But to say I can't write a label about, maybe I'm not allowed to write about white guy stuff.
I'm not allowed to write about French rifles.
Yeah.
Because I'm not French.
Yeah. Do you get any of that though? Like with the French?
Honestly, no. My experience with French arms enthusiasts is that they all love the book and they think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I've gotten a few criticism from a few people for like, oh, well, you don't speak French, so how could you have actually known it?
Yeah.
Or found out? And the answer is twofold. Part is I'm actually doing my darndest to learn French, slowly but surely. And secondly, like language is not the barrier that perhaps it used to be, or it's never been quite as much of a barrier as some people may think.
Yeah. I always think about that with I think that to me language can be a barrier because if you want to know about it and you don't have any sense of what you're reading, it'd be.
It's interesting to look at Arasakas.
Okay.
Because most of the records dealing with Arasaka production were destroyed during the war.
Mm-hmm.
Like we did a very thorough job of bombing the crap out of all the Japanese arsenals.
Yeah.
And yet there is a tremendous amount of deep scholarly research and understanding of Arasaka production. Mm-hmm. And it has basically all been reverse engineered from examination of the physical objects. Mm-hmm. Like you get together enough of them, the Arasakas are a series manufacturer. And like right at the very beginning, they don't number the series on the gun.
Yeah.
They're identified by kana symbol from a Japanese poem. And this symbol is the first syllable in the poem, and so that's 1. And this is the second syllable, and that represents 2.
Yeah.
And even something that basic about the guns was put back together by one of the very early researchers who was looking at a ton of these guns and started recognizing that, oh, the parts, the design is deteriorating over time. And each one of the, like, we can figure out what these symbols indicate.
Yeah.
Because we can tell when the guns are older and when they're newer. And then, you get a few of them in place, and you're like, oh, this is that classic poem. So, and all of this essentially could have been done with basically no understanding of the Japanese language, but having all of the objects.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that it wouldn't have been a lot easier. And there's certainly information that we would know that we don't if we had access to some of those original records. But
yeah, and that's one of the big, and that's where you also get into the conversation of objective history, and the reality is we won't ever have all the history because it gets lost. So to some extent, we do have to make judgment calls. But yeah, the museum field has gotten weird.
It's a shame.
I feel like
That's really a shame.
I could say that. It's gotten weird. Not all of it. There's lots of, my clients all clearly very much want to find the best way to interpret their objects, and Cody's still, Danny's great at that. And Danny's very object-centric in terms of his passion and that kind of thing. And so it's, there are some museums that hold on, but there is this weird movement in the museum world. Like when we went to the National Council on Public History's conference, it was very clear that there was a bias against guns, gun museums, gun history, and those people felt like they were the actual authorities. I had a conversation with someone. It was actually really sad. They asked me to be because I was young and running a museum and a project director on something. They had me be there so that people could basically speed date, talk to me about the museum field. And because I worked with guns, a lot of people didn't talk to me. And this one guy, I remember talking about the gun history and trying to explain the larger, history of firearms, and violence is a part of firearms history, but it's one part, and blah, 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 blah. My elevator speech. And he goes, well, is that realistic or presentist? And I was like,
ooh, presentist.
I love
That's
that
a
word.
fun new word.
I love presentist.
Wow.
Yeah, actually, it's one of my favorite words because we do a lot of that in the gun world. Machine guns. We were talking about that yesterday. The term machine gun and what a machine gun is. But yeah, so he said, is that presentist? And I was like, everything's kind of presentist. But I looked at him and I was like, no, that's the actual history. It's not me trying to make it fit something. It really, it was like this. But, he didn't realize his opinion, his view and perception was, in fact, the one that was presentist. And should we explain what presentism is for the...
Go for it. I'm not going to... I have never heard that word.
Oh, really?
Until you just said it.
And now I've said it 6 times, so it's ingrained in your brain. So presentism is a fancy, I don't even think Microsoft Word recognizes it as a word. I'm pretty sure I get the little squiggly line every time I use it. But basically it's taking your present perspective, present beliefs, present everything, and imposing your beliefs on the past. Okay. So, which again, I think everything's to some extent presentist because of that, but
to some extent it kind of has to be.
Yeah. So basically judging something based on today's norms.
Unless
in the
you
past.
are that reenactor.
Yeah, right. But yeah, so judging something on today, by today's standard.
Okay.
I think probably firearms advertisements. I always try to say, because people I make jokes because old firearms advertisements are really weird.
Oh, there's some really interesting stuff.
Oh yeah, especially to women, but culture of the time, and trying to not judge it based on what I think today.
There's some great Maxim silencer advertisements out there.
I have a whole catalog, and Cody has a lot of good Maxim ads. I think my favorite one is the one where they're shooting inside the house. And I don't know if it's I think it's a Christmas ad. And they're it's these 2 people and they're shooting into another room. So you can't see who's in the room. And I swear to God, that box that they used to sell that box, the Target box, that it was sitting on a sewing machine or something. Hey guys, what is that? Dude, I did a thing about it. We're wait, and zoom in on it. But yeah, Maxim's ads are really good.
There's one is your neighbor's cat annoyingly loud at night? You get a Maxim silencer and you can just shoot it and they'll never know the difference.
Yeah, and we wonder why people don't know how silencers work today.
Yeah.
I actually just did a talk about that. We can't have to get into it about silencers versus suppressors.
I used to be very much on the side of like, oh, suppressor is the correct term.
Oh,
it's the
no.
technically accurate term.
I like to say silencer just to piss people off.
Silencer is Maxim invented it. Maxim patented it. Maxim called it the silencer.
His company was called the Silencer.
The Maxim Silent Firearms Company.
And then Silencer. And then it changed, yeah.
So
yeah.
I no longer have any compunction about using either term.
Oh yeah, if we're gonna go down that rabbit hole, yeah, that's been my belief from day one. I say it like, I say a lot of that too because 1 second, my dog is now. Yes, there's a dog under the table.
We really have to figure out some way to get him on camera.
I'll just we can just
50% more views if he shows his face.
Furry face. We'll just turn the camera at the end. You can do a little. That way they have to watch until the end to see my dog. But yeah, so what I was saying. Oh, silencers. Yeah, because he did. That was what he called it. He invented it. He got to make that call. That's why it's in the National Firearms Act like that. So I don't think that saying suppressor or silencer, means that one's not important or relevant. It's just in different contexts it makes sense. But for someone to berate someone for saying silencer, that is.
There are some words that people get evangelical about.
Oh yeah.
Silencer is one. Clip and magazine is one.
Assault rifle.
No. Well, yes and no.
Assault weapon, assault rifle.
So what's interesting to me is I will get people who will tell me adamantly that an assault rifle is a fake thing.
I know. Sorry.
Well,
I've gotten yelled at a lot.
Assault rifle is an entirely real thing.
Yeah.
In other languages, there's a ton of formally designated. This is the assault rifle 43, 57, 50, whatever.
Yeah.
Assault weapon is a term that originates in U.S. law.
Yeah.
And that's the one that really doesn't have any actual technical merit. It has a legal description, but it does not have a technical firearms meaning.
Yeah. Well, and
but people get so hooked on hate, they see the word assault and they see it being used politically.
Yeah.
And they just get this focus on that word, and it morphs from being, I don't like the way that word's being used, into that must just not be real.
Exactly. No, I say the same thing. What's funny is I didn't know that you had these beliefs on this. And those are my exact. I get on people all the time about it. And I did a video with Recoil years ago where I made a joke because I said the first, one of the first assault rifles, and I leaned over at STG and picked up the Burton light machine rifle. I thought I was hilarious, and there were hundreds of comments of people being like, "There's no such thing as an assault rifle," but they were conflating assault weapon and assault rifle. And then I had another person when I was doing a PBS NewsHour special Sunday. We were me and Mr. Rogers, having a little sit down talking about guns. And I was standing in front of a case. There were AR-15s behind me. It was Cody, the renovation. And we were talking about assault rifles, terminology, and that kind of thing. And of course, they didn't edit it to make me sound bad or anything. It made perfect sense. It just happened that we were standing in front of a case, and so they were talking about assault rifles. And so we were, using that term, and someone was like, "You're an idiot. How dare you stand in front of a case of AR-15s and talk about assault rifles? You're, meanwhile, it wasn't it was like we were walking. It wasn't like I was it wasn't like it was planned. But the funny thing about it was they were the selective fire AR-15s.
Oh, huh. So they were assault rifles.
Yes, and they didn't want to listen to me. I had to block her because she was so mean. I don't need to get called an idiot a million times. Don't do that. Don't call me an idiot, even if you think that way.
The mag versus clip one is interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's correct. A magazine is not the same as a clip.
Yeah.
However, you go back about 50 years, and the two get used interchangeably in very official terminology.
Yeah.
I can pull up U.S. military training documentation that talks about the clips for your 1911.
I didn't know.
Yeah, it's out there. And so it's yes, we should use these terms properly, but that doesn't mean that this is an end-all, be-all litmus test of any sort of level of knowledge.
Yeah. Well, and I just lost my train of thought on that. But it's always fascinating to me, the comparisons and the way that people, they get so bogged down in it. And it's funny because the people would confuse clip and magazine back in history. Shows you that, look, people haven't changed that much.
Yeah.
But the other one, too, is semi-automatic and automatic in terms of handguns.
Oh, Nick Jensen-Jones has griped at me about my use of that one.
Oh, yeah. I don't know how you use it.
So when I'm talking about early semi-automatic pistols, I will fairly often or reasonably often use the term automatic pistol.
Yeah.
Because it was used at the time. And the distinction was you have revolvers and you have manually operated stuff. And then you have automatic pistols.
Yeah.
The automatic pistol does all the stuff automatically. A volcanic does not.
Yeah.
Well, but that's before anyone was talking about semi-auto versus full auto. It was just semi-automatic.
Yeah.
And now today, an automatic pistol, technically, and Nick is correct about this, technically is a fully automatic pistol.
Exactly, yeah.
And I tend to use the antiquated term when I'm talking about the older guns. And I probably shouldn't, but I like the term, and I haven't gotten myself to stop yet.
You know what, and I think it's funny, I talk about, you could say whatever you want, and I don't say automatic, even though I'll point out that, it's a semi-automatic, and then I'll say, but, don't be confused because they were sold as automatic pistols. We totally left museums, and now we're just talking about gun.
Yeah, now we're just rambling.
I still haven't had that much of my...
I know, it's because you're busy talking. It's not working.
That's why I'm here.
This is true. Yes. By the way, you have to watch the commercial for these guys.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm just going to leave it at that.
All right. They get a homework assignment too.
I may link to it in the end cards of the video because
should.
it's a pretty excellent commercial.
All right, I'll look it up. But yeah, so jargon. And jargon's important to museums. See, I brought it back around.
Absolutely. Yes, it is.
Understanding the terminology, because actually it's really interesting. I think we've talked about this, so I don't have to talk about it too much. But, most gun collections in museums originally were run by gun collectors, which there's some that are amazing at it, and then there are some that get bogged down on the buttons, like the reenactor, and they don't understand the bigger picture. And then museum professionals don't typically study guns. So what happens is you get a lot of museums, because guns are so prevalent in American museums.
I see where this is going.
Yeah, so guns are so prevalent in American museums, you get a lot of people who have no background in firearms, and often in the museum field a hostility towards firearms, and then they inherit a gun collection. And so as a result, you get people trying to write interpretation on something they know nothing about. It's kind of like the collections manager trying to maintain, not needing to know anything about the actual grander history. I think the best curator that had that happen to him, that did an amazing job, and I don't know if you've ever run into him in your career, but Jeffrey Richardson at the Autry.
No, I have not been there.
Oh, yeah, he's not there anymore, but he was, I think he was the curator of pop culture, like Western history, pop culture, and pop culture, didn't have a firearms background. They lumped the firearms in, so they added and firearms to it, which, by the way, I still think is a great job. Pop culture and guns, like, come on. But he didn't have the background in firearms. And then he went on to write several prominent books on, Colt firearms and the guns, because they've got a really impressive Colt collection in there. And so, that's the exception to the rule, though. The person that comes from the museum field and then, decides to learn about guns. I came from, I want to work in a museum and I want to learn about guns. So when I came in, I was both. There are only probably a handful of us that are both, and try to encourage as many people as possible. But of course, I'm making a video where I'm bitching about museums.
You're also, you're not doing a great job recruiting.
Not great advocacy. You can fix it, okay? You can fix this, because that is actually the reality. Right now, the museum field's going in a weird, political route, which is odd for nonprofits. But they're going into a very politicized direction.
I like that though.
That drives me nuts. I'm like, you're a nonprofit. You're not supposed to be political. It drives me crazy. But so you've got, like, the museum field is full of people that believe it should be politically driven and more like morally driven. So we need more people that disagree with that to bring the scale back. So you should get in the field, even though we have now pointed out that you're understaffed, underpaid.
You won't like it, but you should do it.
I like it. That's why I don't work for you. No. I mean, there are things that I loved about the museum, the Cody Museum, any museum really for that matter. I prefer being a consultant though. And that's because I love going into a museum and being the problem solver.
Okay.
One thing that I think museums, this is probably every industry. It's probably not just museums, but like it's amazing to me. And I joke all the time that I'm like, so when I worked for you, you paid me this, now, and you didn't listen to me, and you hired a consultant. And I'm like, and now I'm the consultant getting paid 3 times as much for the same advice, but now you listen to me because I don't work for you.
No, they're listening to you because they're paying you 3 times as much.
I guess that's true.
Therefore, your advice is worth 3 times as much as it was before.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
That is a consulting thing in every industry.
That's because like even my parents, my dad, and like other like people that I know, I mean, in their fields, like they're really well versed in what they do, but it's somehow we always hire a consultant. Thank you for museums for doing that, to come in and and they're taken a lot more seriously. So I like to come into fires, put them out, and then leave, because there is the bureaucracy element of a lot of museums. And like I was very fortunate when I was running Cody that like essentially the curators had carte blanche. Like as long as we had the funding, we followed the procedure, like we could do what we wanted to do. Now we still had minimal staff, and all of those things came into play, but it was great. But yeah, most museums don't operate like that. There's, a collections committee. So like, as a curator, a lot of places you can't say, I want that gun or that artifact. You have to now wait until your monthly committee meeting, which is comprised of all, and there are pros to that. Like, I don't want to accept a million different things and then have the person who has to process the paperwork be like, I have a million things coming from like one of the other museums or from a different, department. So there are pros to that, but the fact that you can't, just say yes right away to something that you could lose if you wait,
It's hard to overestimate how much what seems like trivial friction in a process can really quickly prevent anything from happening.
Yeah. And this is probably not unique to museums as well, but Peter's Principle I have found to be very popular. You know Peter's Principle?
No.
Oh, Peter's Principle. I'm just full of new terms
I'm learning
today.
all sorts of stuff.
Peter's Principle is being promoted to the level of to the level of incompetence.
Okay.
So like you might be really good at your job, and then they promote you, and you might be like not as good, but like you're still good, and then you get promoted, and then like you suck, like because you're promoted to your level of incompetence. So you were great maybe at the beginning, and you could have handled it a step down, but now you've been promoted, and you're stuck there. I found that to happen a lot, and to some extent maybe I was Peter's Principle. I was a Peter's Principle because when they handed me the keys to the kingdom in Cody, I mean, I was 25,
Damn.
24, 25. Like, who does that? Like, who thought that was a good idea? I mean, it worked out well, so good gamble, but like, I didn't know how to run a museum. My museum studies certificate, I had a specific historical area that I have a master's in, and I have a certificate in museum studies. I just like to make that, because some people just get museum degrees and they don't actually have an area of emphasis, but I did. I didn't know how to manage a budget. Like, that wasn't anything. So I guess I did. So my advice is if you get Peter's Principle into something, you ask as many people as possible. Like you don't because a lot of people they hunker down. They're like, I don't know, so I'm not gonna say anything because I don't want people to know that I don't know. And I was like, maybe that was just being 25. I was like, help me. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I knew the gun stuff, but I didn't know any of the other stuff. And so but that happens. I mean, people end up in these positions and. Yeah. And then they've got the red tape that almost protects those people, and it becomes very hard. It's like the academic system, and even public education. Once you're tenured, there's no tenure in the museum field, but essentially once you're a lifer,
right.
You're considered a lifer. You can do lots of wrong, but it doesn't get seen.
Yeah.
Which is actually part of the issue in the museum field is that, there's a lot of us that sit there in institutions and watch people who are not good at their job not get reprimanded, and then you get reprimanded for something, but you are good at your job, and you both should have been reprimanded,
That's demoralizing.
And that's, I know the world's not perfect. I'm not asking, it's not like, woe is me, but at the same time, that does discourage a lot of people from wanting to continue in the field because they're like, or I think it might make some people not just leave the field, but then some people become those people that aren't doing anything because, well, why should I work really hard if I can just have this
coast and
this cush job and get paid to not do anything, and so that bureaucracy is so strong in the museum field, and it's really unfortunate. I believe in museums. I know in the private collector versus museum debate, I do still believe in museums. I just think that something has to happen. Something has to change. I think you can still trust your collections in museums, most museums, I think you just have to do your research to see what you're comfortable with, what their track record is, that kind of thing.
And know what they're going to do with it.
Yeah, exactly. But I also think that the museum field is heading in a really weird way that people should also be aware of when they're making those considerations. Because it's not like the people who are creating the politically charged museum are thinking that that's weird, and that the donor may not think that way. And so it's just, it's an issue. I mean, it's a quagmire, and it's hard for me being someone that loves museums and really supports the museum system. So I guess the best that I do and can do is I work for these other museums who are willing to put the work in, who are willing to do it a way that I agree with, not the right way, but the way that I agree with, which is to go back to a public education center where you're not telling somebody what to think, but you're still giving them information that they need to make that decision. And so, the more places I can work with to help put them on the map, then I hope it'll tip the scale as well eventually. There's a lot of museums in the country, though.
Oh, that sounds like a worthy goal.
Yeah.
So if you have a museum and you want Ashley's help in making it a better museum.
And we can drink whiskey while we're making it better.
And drinking whiskey.
Man, I didn't finish.
No, not yet.
Now
I'm talking. You have a moment. I will include contact information for Ashley because she does do professional consulting on museum development and design. So I'll have that down in the description text. And if this is something that you want her help on, absolutely, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I would love that.
Out, right?
No, I don't. I'm not. I have no exclusivity contracts.
Excellent.
So I'm happy. I do a lot of stuff. If it's firearms history related, I'm working on it. The one thing I don't do, and I'm going to point this out because I don't ever point this out, and I'm starting to get inundated by these requests, and they're really not what I do, is I get a lot of individual private inquiries on guns.
I found this in my attic. What's it worth?
Yeah, and you know what? If I know and I can, I'll answer. That's totally fine. But that's really, there are people who are better at doing that. Oh shoot! Did I just tell everyone, if you have a question about a gun, contact Ian. He will get back to you in a timely fashion.
Oh God, I do my best.
Yeah,
I'm best at French rifles.
Yeah,
I get a lot of. It's interesting. The majority. Okay, I'm going to divert this to me for a minute.
You tell me to finish my drink.
The conundrum I run into, or the ironic situation I run into, is I get a lot of those emails. But if it's a gun that I know about, the chances are reasonably high that I've done a video on it. Mm-hmm. I've got 2,600 videos posted at this point. And if I've done a video on it, there's a reasonable chance, not always, but there's a decent chance someone has already looked and oh, there's the video, and they don't email me.
Yeah.
The only ones I get emailed for are the ones that I've never filmed and don't know about. So I get a lot of old percussion shotguns, percussion rifles, not actual Kentucky rifles, but Kentucky rifle kit builds, that kind of stuff. I get a lot of that. And so it's a little demoralizing that most of the emails I get of, oh, I found this, what is it? I really don't know. I know nothing about Belgian shotguns from the 1890s. Here's a trivia question for you.
Okay.
Of those guns that I do recognize, and this isn't me specifically, this is a lot of gun forums. When someone posts, I found this in the attic, what is it? About 50% of the time, I can tell you what it is without even looking at the picture.
What is it? Is that the question?
It is an Arisaka.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That's interesting.
Because there is nothing you can Google written on an Arisaka.
That makes sense.
Mausers say Mauser or DWM, and there's lots of English character stuff that you can punch into Google.
Yeah.
Arisakas have a serial number and some Japanese characters and nothing else.
No, that makes sense. I actually want to say that I'm very proud of your audience for knowing that they can look at your videos. Because when I was at Cody, people would ask us very basic questions that they could have looked up themselves and they didn't. So I'm impressed that you do actually, that your audience does really look into that. But that's one thing I don't do a ton. I mean, what I always do is I just give them the name of someone that I know that knows more about it than me. But it's just something I decided in my consulting business that I'm not going to focus on because I love big picture history. I love macro history. I love being able to distill the technical stuff that you do and distill that for the public of okay, so this is now I have all this information because you guys did the scholarship on the technical, and then what can I do with it to make it
And this 80%
accessible?
is completely irrelevant to almost everybody.
You're right. It's so true. yeah, like, you know,
I get it.
like, yeah, because there's different audiences. And so
absolutely.
for me, that's what I've ended up focusing on. So I'm happy to, if you have questions like that, I'm happy to look at them and I'll pass you to whomever. But I think a lot of people make the assumption that I'm like the female version of you, you know, and I'm not. Like, because people are always like on my page, like, we should do like a trivia contest between Ashley and Ian. And I'm like, we will both fail because our areas of,
well, that depends who asks the questions.
Yeah, it depends on what the questions are because, like, you know, we could, like, I was like, we don't really have a lot of crossover in, like, our areas of expertise. I know nothing about French rifles.
Good team for a general firearms trivia contest.
Yes, yeah, because he's got the technical, I've got the overall, you know, we can kind of merge it. And if you want to know a lot about Colt-type single actions and the history of revolver safeties, that's where I can talk 5,000 words in RMAX. About.
Nice.
Yeah. So, but yes, gun stuff, gun history, I'm happy to answer the questions. I also do a lot of expert testimony. I think there's a lot of value in historians getting involved in expert reports because I found, especially in product liability, they always hire engineers. And I actually, my first one I worked on, I was rebutting to the statement, so I didn't write one. I had to wait. And I wrote it in advance because it was my first expert witness testimony, so I wanted to be prepared. I had to delete half of what I had written when I saw that the thing I was supposed to respond to because I would have given the other side more information than they had. Like it's crazy to me. I mean, like they'll talk about, well, you know, the transfer or not, yeah, the transfer bar, you know, it was Ivor Johnson. Well, it's a double action that doesn't operate the same. They operate differently than Colts. And the engineer, who should know that, didn't have the perspective of knowing historically that's a different thing. And so I advocate that, like, you should be doing it.
I've gotten asked a couple times, but it's never gotten as far, it's never even gotten close to actually getting into a courtroom.
Oh,
which I would like. I'd really like to at least try it once.
I was an expert on the assault weapons case in California.
That's right, I heard about
and
that.
I got to go and do evidentiary hearing in front of Judge Benitez. That was cool.
Nice.
He's a trip. It was a public hearing, so it was, you know, so people are aware of it. But it was just, I guess federal judges kind of sometimes go and do things that, like, most judges won't. So, like, you know, if you're in a hearing, the lawyers are asking the questions, but, like, federal judges sometimes will just interject and be like, "No, I've got questions," you know, and, like, come at you with it. And so I've been enjoying that, honestly, because it's also really basic for me. Like, with the assault weapons case, it was the lawsuits are built on faulty logic, and that's, you know, I don't care how you feel about it. They're built on faulty logic, which is why they keep getting put into the court system. And two of the biggest conversations are common use and unusually dangerous. And so the work that I've been doing most recently has been, like, with the assault weapons case. I took every feature and every trait associated with the California assault weapon, and I traced it to its historical origin, which in a lot of cases was the 1600s. So, you know, there's centuries of common use by the current definition, and so you cannot say that it's not in common use because that's how they get around doing that kind of stuff. So if you're a historian, it really, and it's very simple for me. Like, that wasn't hard, you know. It's amazing to me the value that history has in these modern cases.
It's not in the legal side, but I've talked to a number of firearms design engineers for some major companies who will occasionally talk about, like, oh yeah, we had this idea and we looked it up on your channel and found that, oh yeah, they tried this in, you know, 100 years ago, and this is what didn't work. And so we use that to tweak our idea, and I love it when someone relates a story like that to me. That's fantastic.
You know, and you're, like, sneaky dangerous too, because nobody thinks the historian's going to do anything that would possibly throw you for a loop. But it is, you know, it's interesting to see practical applications of that history.
That Chambers machine gun.
Oh yeah.
Full auto first proposed in the 1790s.
That's awesome.
Like Roman candle style full auto. Black powder, muzzle loading. Fantastic gun. You know what? That's going to be the other end card link in this video, is the Chambers gun.
Would you consider the Belton to be a machine gun?
The Burton?
The Belton. Belton Fusel. It's
Uh-oh. Do tell.
No.
So, no, I will redeem myself here by saying it's the Belton Fusil.
Oh.
Because Fusil
Sorry.
Then again, I didn't
Americanist. What can I say?
Then again, I don't know what it is, apparently.
Yeah,
so do tell.
Okay, so It was designed by, I think, Joseph Belton. It gets used in so much political fodder. It drives me nuts when people use super random examples that weren't adopted, because it's like there are lots of examples of similar technology that were actually in the consumer hands and very very much used during the 1700s. But the Belton Fusi.
Yes.
Okay.
Every letter in it is produced
The
either
Belton
weird or
repeating
not at all.
rifle.
Yes.
The Belton repeating rifle. It operates like a Roman candle, so it's a rifle that has all the charges lined up, and you press the trigger and it fires like it's same thing as the chambers. So I guess, and that's Revolution. So I think it's a little bit before the chambers. Actually, we'll have to check. I don't know when the patent was for it. They're probably right around the same time. But if it's a Roman candle, one trigger pull with that.
I consider that essentially a machine gun.
Yeah.
Because now the difference is you can't make it stop.
Yeah.
It's not select fire, sort of. It's a runaway, unstoppable reaction.
So it ran away.
On the chambers, it either runs till it's empty or till one of the barrels malfunctions.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like 50-50, which is going to happen.
Well, and the Belton, I mean, it was patented. We know it exists. We know it existed, but there was a government contract for it, but it was too expensive. There's a lot of like gossip as to why it didn't end up being made. And then a lot of the Beltons today are considered forgeries, so that they say have survived. So it's like there's some questionable concepts in the context and the history of like, we know it was a thing, there was a patent, we know the government ordered a contract, but like, why is it that all of the ones that survived are considered forgeries? Because
maybe they are.
I was going to say something about an auction company, but
auction companies have driven the profits that you can get from selling something to a wide. Well, it kind of goes either way, actually. Sometimes selling at auction gets you the most money because it's exposure to a wide audience. Sometimes, and your infamous cult cases like this, sometimes you get the most money by having a very private sale to a single collector. Ideally, a collector who doesn't really know what they're looking at and is depending on the advice of their expert, who is ideally in your pocket.
Are you talking about Larry?
Possibly. And gets a kickback from it. So it goes either way.
Yeah. Sorry.
But we were just talking about colliers.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this video is probably going to come out before any of the collier stuff, but the collier is a fantastically important element of firearms history and extremely rare.
Yeah.
And so that has generated people making fake ones, sometimes to make money on them, and sometimes because they are such an enthusiast that if they can't find a real one, they would rather have an homage to a collier or an homage to a Belton. And make it themselves. Yeah.
Well, I think Rock Island just recently sold Beltons, but they said that they were forgery. I mean, they said that they were forgeries.
That's beautiful.
I think that they had them and they didn't know, and then they pulled them when they found out, and then they resold them as forgeries. But yeah, I mean, so that's the Belton. So I guess theoretically, we'll have to check the patent dates on that.
Yeah, it sounds very similar. I would call that a machine gun.
Yeah.
By the legal definition, it is one trigger pull and fires more than one shot.
Yeah.
Now, if I remember correctly, the legal definition also includes some other elements.
So I was trying to make something in my brain with the ATF definition, but the ATF can't even make sense of their definition. So
the other term that I will use that isn't really a canon definition, is I will use the term manual machine gun. And I use that to refer to
that's what you were saying.
The crank-operated guns, Gatlings, mitrailleuses, Gardners, ATA.
Why?
Because I think they deserve a categorization, because they're more than just a repeating rifle. They're generally set up more like artillery than like a shoulder arm. But they are not technically machine guns, and they're not legally machine guns either. So what do you call them?
Yeah.
And to me, manual machine gun is kind of the best descriptive catch-all.
Yeah. That makes sense. I don't know. I think that goes into the earlier conversation. Something's flashing anything.
All right. So we are going to wrap this up because we are completely out of battery. So if you want to get in touch with Ashley, check the description text. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. And we're all done.